Hello, this is Daedalus with Nerds and Stuff, and today we'll be putting some paint on that bloody Buccaneer Skarre model. Let's get started. So I've already sprayed the model with a black P3 primer, so that we can just get right into the painting. And I'm going to start that with the base. So we're just going to lay down a coat of Woodstain brown to kind of just build up some of this wood color real quick. And I want to make sure I get real good coverage so that all the wood panels look alike. This floor was made, so we do want them to look somewhat similar, you know, so it maybe looks like they were from the same load of lumber, potentially even the same tree. And it's going to take kind of a lot of paint to go over this coat. Normally when you paint on a primer, it takes a lot of paint to kind of cover up the primer. It almost is like kind of dry, so it sucks a lot of the moisture out, and that's kind of the primer's job. It helps paint stick by doing that. But wood does the same thing. And so the combination of the primer on the wood means I'm going to need a lot of paint for coverage. It just doesn't go very far because the wood sucks it up and the primer sucks it up, and if I don't want to have streaky black poking through, I am just going to have to kind of do a lot of paint. So I don't want to go too thick because I want to try and preserve some of that wood grain texture. So I am kind of not just going straight from the bottle. I have thinned it a little bit. Because if I can keep that wood grain and bring it out, then it'll just make the wood look that much more authentic. So now I'm just going to do a quick dry brushing with some shield brown, kind of the next step up in the Reaper triad for dark browns. I'm hoping to pick up some of that wood grain and also maybe highlight some of the edges on the wood panels. This is why I wanted to do this part first, because dry brushing bases after your whole model's painted always makes me really nervous. I often do it because I forget what I'm doing on the base until I'm finished with the model. But there have been several times when I suddenly have feet that are the wrong color because I've accidentally dry brushed them. So I'm still just going back and doing the same, trying to hopefully leave some streaks behind with the dry brushing to also kind of enhance some of that wood grain type look. I'm also getting the edges, since they're kind of definition points on the model, even though if this wasn't a model, like if this was for static display, it wouldn't be like that because this is just a floor chunk, as it were. Now I'm going through with some Driftwood brown, which is the top color of the triad, and I'm doing the same, doing a very faint dry brush, just trying to get those brown wood grains to stand out even more. So now I'm moving on to the barrels, and I'm just going straight at them with the shield brown. I mostly just want full coverage so that I can work with them later. I also thought these should go first because there's going to be some trouble later with Skarre's cloak and weapon and stuff, and I want to get this majority of this paint out of the way before I get knee deep and spend a lot of time doing other stuff just to come back and mess it up with brown. Brown's kind of one of those colors too that doesn't always provide good coverage. Sometimes I've found that, and it's about maybe 1 in every 5 bottles of brown paint I get, it just doesn't cover very well. Straight out of the bottle I find that it needs a little bit of help, and usually 2 coats to be sure that you get full coverage on the color you actually want. And now when I'm painting this model, I would say, if you haven't assembled her yet, don't glue her to the barrels yet. I know that's what I did in the previous video, but having painted the model now, it would have been a whole lot easier if she was detached. Because there are a lot of tricky angles trying to get behind her and up between her and the barrels and behind her sword, and if I would have left her off and still put the sword on, it would have made painting a lot easier, and that is definitely what I would recommend for anyone else who might be painting this model, who hopefully has not assembled her yet. So this would be the one time I encourage you to not follow along at home. So just making sure we've got that nice even coverage all the way through. I don't want any black streaking through for these barrels. It wouldn't really matter though, because the barrels will end up multi-tone anyway. It kind of makes them look more natural if they're not so uniform. But I wanted to put the multi-tone myself and control where it went. So now we're going to get started just putting some flesh tone down. I just kind of wanted to get this out of the way first so that I could see really where all the flesh was and how much work it was going to take. I thinned the flesh tone fairly well. It is just the Reaper Fair Shadow, but I did thin it in about a 1-to-1, which is going to take a lot of coats when we're covering black. You can kind of see where it's somewhat streaky through there, but I wanted to be sure not to obscure too many details by putting the paint on too thick. This is a great model, and it's got a lot of great details to paint, and I sometimes get a little careless with my skin tones, just wanting coverage, and end up going on a little thick once in a while. And had I primed this model white, if you plan to do so, this step wouldn't have taken so long, because the flesh tones tend to go over white fairly well. They have good coverage, they don't have much bleed. Unfortunately, through black they have a lot. But because of the colored palette I kind of went with for her, I thought starting out with a black base, especially when I have so much brown, would help build more earthier tones and help keep it grounded. Now I've built up a decent flesh tone on everything but her face. We're kind of moving into that. Still just making sure I don't get it on too thick. She doesn't have much for sculpted eyes, unfortunately. So I was trying not to obscure any detail that might be present. And I don't know if maybe I just got a sculpt that wasn't quite perfect in the face, or if that's how she was just sculpted. But she just kind of had cavities. And now we're just getting the other hand, just putting that flesh tone down. I usually try and do my flesh tones first, at least the basis for the flesh tones, because it's so easy to accidentally flick a little bit of paint on them or accidentally graze them with the tip of a brush when doing something else. And if you get the flesh tone down first, you can often make yourself be a little more careful. And then you have just paint covering a little more uniformly. If you wait till the end and then you have splatter from other stuff, flesh tones don't cover very well, so you might get some discrepancies in your color. There's also something to be said for painting your flesh tone last. You end up spending a lot of focus on flesh because it is a little more difficult, but you also run the risk of accidentally painting other stuff, and flesh tone is usually your lowest layer, so it's really easy to accidentally graze other layers that you spend a lot of time on. So now I'm starting on the eyes, and the eyes on this model were difficult. I wanted to show you my different attempts as opposed to just cutting them out, so that you could kind of see different ways I went about trying to do it, so that maybe you'll see something that works for you. I just kept having hand slips and other problems. But I am still using my eye technique, and I do plan to do an Egyptian-style eyeliner for her, because Satyxis are kind of exotic. This model was very small. If you own it, to me, it feels like it's a lot smaller than a lot of the other Cryx models. I haven't focused on many of the smaller Cryx models, mostly painting veins and other larger things. But to me, it felt smaller than I am usually comfortable with. So I ended up using a lot more of my ultra-fine brush than I usually do. That ultrafine brush, by the way, is a Artist Lost Vienna 18-0 spotter. And I really like that brush. I have two of them. I've got one I use for general painting, and then I believe this one I'm using right now is the one I keep separate for ultrafine detail work. I keep it separate and well conditioned so that it has a very fine point, where the other one I use more frequently, and kind of use it as a fine detail but not a precise detail, if that makes sense. The end's not quite as clean, and it's a little more frayed because it's just seen more use. But it's really good for having more control than I do with my liner. Yep, just keep it on with the eyes and trying to make them clean and get them the way I like. But it just wasn't happening. I'm not sure what it was. There I am trying to paint in that detail for the eyeball that's not sculpted in. At least it wasn't on mine. And this other eye, her right eye, excuse me, is like 2/3 of the way covered with hair. So that makes it kind of hard to do the whole process, because I can't really get to most of the eye, including where her pupil probably would be. And there I had a little bit of bleed through on my brush. I guess I dragged it through the wrong spot on the wet palette, and the paint was a little wetter than it should have been, so it ran. But now we've got a pupil. And just painting some of the hair that got a little bit of dab of white when I went in for the eyeball. And now just cleaning up. So now I'm just building additional color around where I had the black, trying to make sure that I don't have any of that black bleeding through with the skin tone. Just putting additional layers, and I kind of accidentally keep covering up my eyeliner. I'm doing this with the ultra fine brush right now and not breathing, and trying my best to get as fine motor control as I can. This one really challenged me for whatever reason. Really had a hard time with those eyes. So just doing one additional little layer on the skin tone, make sure it's still built up well, still fairly uniform. Kind of letting my eyes rest for a second. And now, I believe we're moving on. We're using a little bit of Monarch purple, and this will make up the color for her entire cloak. Now all of the highlighting I do is just Monarch purple with a little bit of white mixed in to kind of bring it up to a lavender almost. I really like this purple paint. I'm not sure if all purple paints are this nice. This is the first one I bought and I fell in love with it, so I haven't bought another bottle since. And whenever I've needed any purple of any lighter varieties, I always just mix it from this Monarch purple because I really like the color. It's been very consistent, has good coverage, and it's just been a good bottle of paint. Got a lot of purple to put on this model, but it's going to look real nice in the end. When all is said and done, it's a good color for her. As some of you might know, my Cryx line, or my personal painting scheme for the army, is usually blues. I don't tend to stick to the faction colors. I like to paint my Cryx blue because I think blue is a little more fun to paint than black. But this one is actually going to be pretty close to a studio scheme. I did just like how much they painted theirs with a purple coat with yellow trim, and it just looked really nice. And she's a pirate captain. She's not quite a full-blown like Cryx necromancer in the same rights. I mean, she is, but hers is more blood magic than magic from the Dragon Father. And so I wanted her to match the army, but still kind of be independent. When I paint future Satyxis, I'll kind of follow suit. Which I have them sitting in a box, just need to pull them out and assemble them. They're on the massive wait list. Just being very careful, using my really fine brush to hit these smaller areas, especially near the skin barrier after I spent all that time building the color up. I didn't want to go and drop something nice and dark on it. Pull all that color right back down. And I did lose my holder. My blue tack hasn't been sticking very well lately. I might have to find a different solution for that. So if you have any ideas or any recommendations, go ahead and let me know. I'm in the market for a new vise or something to hold these models. I've tried helping hands before and it hasn't really worked for me. But if there's anything you use that you think I might like, just leave it in the comments so I can check it out. I'd really appreciate it. So now that I've got that first layer of purple on, I want to let it sit and kind of fully dry. So I'm just going through some black and doing some touch-ups. Getting those few areas around her head. I think I might have got a bad can of black primer. This one just rubs off super easily. So I end up running into a lot of problems throughout this model where the black primer just kind of comes off. And just doing a few further touch-ups. Did a little bit of brown there, and now doing, we'll call it like metal prep. I always put black down for my silver metals, and lately I've been doing the silver first and then putting a bronze on top of silver. That's what I've been doing for my Cryx army, and I really like how shiny and bright it is when I do use that accent. But it also looks really nice on a brown, too, so, either one works, and they both look really nice. So now I'm just going to lay down some Chainmail silver, This is from the Vallejo Game Air line. They're some of the best metallic paints I've ever had. The Game Air line is intended to go directly through an airbrush, so these metallic paints are really thin. What is being applied right now is straight out of the bottle. I rarely thin them, and I just really love their pigment quality. They're really ground fine, so that you can dilute them if you want. But I know the first metallic paints I had were from the Reaper line. They're what I liked, so that's what I bought. And they were thick, really thick. And I couldn't thin them. As soon as I did, the pigments would separate out and they'd get really watery. And then it was just like painting on glitter. You know, I had no color to it. Just shine. And I worked with that for a while and just would either paint on thick or just slowly build up coats. And then I tried one of these Vallejo Game Airs after seeing a kind of a review online, and I loved them. So I actually got the whole Game Air metallic paint line. And they're the only metallic paints I use. I've heard the next step up from these is the actual metallics. They're called liquid metals, and they're like made with real metallic fragments in an alcohol suspension, I guess. And so they literally grind up metal and you paint that on. But I have heard that stuff is really hard on your brushes, can't be diluted with water, and honestly, that's a step too far. And some of these guys, especially in like the wargaming, like historical wargaming painting, they'll use those metallic paints and actually apply pigments that genuinely corrode the metals. So they are literally weathering the metals on their models, and it does a very genuine look. I'll give them that. But that's a step beyond, I think, where I want to be. I like what I can do with weathering pigments and metallic paints. And if that's what you do, I admire you for it. That's some true dedication. You have my awe and my respect. So we're just hitting all of those metallic bits with the chainmail silver. We got shoulder pads and breastplate, her chain skirt, knee pads, little toe guards on her boots. As well as her heels. I decided to go with metallic heels, just for flavor. They're probably never going to get seen anyway, on the shaded side of the model. And then I'm getting her gun as well. And applying some brown for the leather. Now this is also shield brown. I normally pull a leather brown, but I wanted a darker leather. The leather brown I have tends to be a little more lighter, and that just wasn't the kind of leather I wanted to go for. So I made it darker, and I really like that turned out. So I applaud myself, toot my own horn. Just making sure there were no other leather bits I needed to get. And I kind of covered up a little bit of the metallic, so I'm getting the belt buckle and the top of her pistol. Now I'm just cleaning up the face a little bit more. I'm highlighting some parts. I've cut in a little bit of lighter flesh tone to kind of help build up a slight highlight before I apply a wash. So I'm just building up the color and making those areas in direct light kind of brighter. You know, basic highlighting. And unfortunately on this model, most all of her skin is in direct light, so not a lot to work on. And now we're just going to paint the boots. And they're black boots, going for black leather. So I am just taking black paint, covering it all, and slowly cutting in more and more of the Vallejo Game Color Ghost Gray to increase the tone, and it only needs a little bit. Ghost Gray is a very bright gray. I would call it more of an off-white, to tell you the truth. So it just takes a little bit. Normally black has got the high pigment concentration, so you just add a lot of gray and a little bit of black. This one tends to be the opposite. So it's saving me a lot on black paint, because I don't have to put in as much, but if I do more than just a tiny touch, then it goes way too bright. So I'm just picking out all of those little details in the boots. There's a lot of kind of folds and ruffles. And I'm just slowly kind of applying one additional layer of glaze at a time, cutting in a little bit more gray each time to build up that color slowly and kind of progressively. Make a nice smooth transition so it looks more natural. I really like painting black. I said before that I don't want to do a whole army of it, but I can make it look really good. I think if I did it for my primary army, like following the studio scheme for the Cryx army, I think I would just get bored of it and then not want to paint it. But black is a great tone. I mean, you can actually just do a black and white model if you've never seen one of those before. It actually can look really cool. Just a monochrome. And if you do it right and just kind of do the slow layering and are patient with it, you can really make these smooth transitions, and it really adds a lot to your model. Especially from tabletop distance. Because it stands out, it's bright, you can clearly see what's going on, and then you pick it up and you look close, and you can see all that extra work that went into it. So now we're just doing, this is like the final layer, an extreme gray highlight. This is like right at the very edge, and it's the brightest part. So we've done slow progressive jumps. This is a dramatic jump. And it's kind of like a highlight you would put on the edge of a blade to kind of make it look sharp. The very, very edges. And these are the spots that will really stand out. Okay, so next up we're just going to be applying a wash kind of to the cloak. I wanted to really get the recesses dark before adding additional layers of purple on. This wash is about kind of a 2-to-1 Carrobug Crimson to Drakenhof Nightshade. The Drakenhof is very strong, and then I thinned that even further. I just wanted a little bit, not much. Now I'm coming back through with that highlighted purple, the real light lavender, in a glaze. I've thinned it so that I can just build color slowly and not dramatically. And just doing some highlighting where is appropriate. Touches. And they're technically right. But I personally don't mind putting some highlight where the light won't touch if it makes the model more interesting. Now, like I just did on the underside of the cloak there, it won't be as pronounced. I'm not going to do the extreme highlights down there. But I think it gives the model additional depth because it shows the fabric is living. Yeah, you can just have it be in shadow, and that looks great. But for me, I like to give it that highlight. It's those little things that kind of stand out when you're really looking at it when it's on the shelf 6 months later. It's like, wow, this model looks really nice. So just slowly building up those color highlights, using that glaze. You can see it starting to work on like her hips and kind of the edge of the lapels, as well as the tops of her cuffs. And I'm slowly cutting in a little bit more white as we go, to kind of slowly brighten it up and get a little more dramatic highlight going on. As the color builds, eventually you'll reach a point of saturation where you're as bright as you're going to get with the existing color, because when you put down an additional layer, you're putting down the paint color that's there. You know, you can only build the color up to the point of the color. So then you have to increase the brightness or the contrast, or you know, however you want to adjust it to continue to highlight, be it adding red or blue or whatever you choose for your method. For me on this model, I went with white because I didn't want blue tones pulling through on the purple, and I didn't want kind of red tones pulling through. I just wanted to keep it purple. So there you can see now I'm doing a real dramatic glaze, and this is a very thin, but I cut in a lot, and this is just the real extreme. I built up that tone, and this is just as I was talking about, kind of taking the next step up. Just getting all those details, all those folds in her cloak, her jacket, all those places where kind of her body is shaped underneath. This is kind of where the artist gets a chance to tell more than is shown. You know, you can paint it flat, and you wouldn't be wrong. It's a flat color. But she's got a lot of curves on the backside there. That sounds terrible, but that you can manipulate using your highlights to make more pronounced, and they stand out. It gives the model more depth. It's what turns your three-dimensional kind of coloring book into a three-dimensional painting, if you will. So now you should be able to see the really extreme differences. And now I'm just doing another kind of dark wash to just bring all that in and tone it down just a little bit. This is a technique I use often. I'll highlight up higher than I want to kind of force an extreme contrast, and then I'll wash back in. And when you do this, especially if you wash with a similar tone, a blue or a black on this purple, for instance, you end up pulling out the pigments that are similar across all the different layers, and it helps to force the blend. I do this on black a lot too, and it ends up looking really good. This was a really thin wash too, so I'm going through a couple of times and adding a couple of layers, because I really want to bring out those light pigments, make sure everything's got good coverage. I'm not worried about excessive pooling, because it is such a thinned out wash. I guess when it's this thin, it's truly more, it acts more like a glaze almost than a true wash. So once that's dry, I'm just kind of doing some skin touch-ups. I'll be prepping to do the wash on that. And now I'm taking a little bit of Woodstain brown and just doing like, the best way I could describe it would be like a smear brush. So it's not like a true dry brush, because I'm not trying to hit raised edges, I'm just kind of mashing it in. But it's technically, I guess, similar to a dry brush. What I'm doing is adding texture to the wood. So by doing this, I'm making the wood look a lot less flat. And then I'm washing that with watered down Agrax Earthshade. Just thinned 1-to-1 like I have been. To kind of darken it up and really fill in. There's so many of those wood-lined crevices that I really wanted a wash to pull those out. It's great detail that really should be seen. I mean, they're nice barrels. And given that on the model there's her in the barrels, they should look pretty nice. And then just putting that same watered down wash on the floor to help kind of, like I was just talking about with the purple, help smooth out the tones in the different browns that are already on the floor. And now we're just putting a little bit of that thinned wash on the leather too, just kind of give it a little bit of depth. And now we're coming through with the Vallejo Game Air Bright Bronze and just hitting the accent points. I really like to accent with this model, so I'm getting, you know, like she has the bolts on her kind of neck choker collar thing, as well as the sides of her toes, and I like to do my trim this way too, on armor. So just getting that done. This is a great color. Sometimes it doesn't cover very well though. It does, but over silver sometimes it's hard to see. It usually takes 2 coats to really stand out as a real brass or bronze. Over brown though, it just covers real well, real nice and neat. So just picking out those armor trim pieces. And I decided I'd make the flintlock on the top of the pistol also, kind of that bright bronze. And then getting the trim on the knee pads, or spike pads. They're not very padded. I imagine kneeling those would actually hurt quite a lot. And her other knee doesn't quite have the same spike to it. It does have a little bit of trim though, kind of like the shoulder pads. And then she's got kind of this, best I can describe would be like kind of a brass eagle on her bustier. So just going to do that real quick, make sure that's nice and clean too, so that we've got definition and it's not quite so monochrome. Trying not to get the flesh. And that's pretty much it for this video. If you like what you see, please subscribe to the channel so you can be notified when additional videos come out. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Until next time, happy painting!